Welcome, everyone. We continue our series entitled League of Women Voters, Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors. We're so glad that you're with us here tonight. My name is David Bodary. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and your host this evening as we discuss our topic, communicating across our differences in a misinformation age. Our guests this evening are Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Gish, who is a program officer with the Kettering Foundation, where she works on research related to faith-based organizations, polarization, and higher education. She has done her undergraduate work at Miami and Ohio universities and graduate work at Harvard University. Her research interests focus on how everyday people can come together across difference to solve problems. And our other guest is her sister, Kathleen Gish, who is my colleague, assistant professor at Sinclair Community College, where she teaches sociology, exploring the roles that our social structures, and particularly politics and economics, shape culture and individual experience as we gather and use, or in some cases misuse, information in our world. She holds her bachelor's from Wright State University and a master's degree from the University of Kentucky, and is pursuing her doctorate from the University of Cincinnati. So, welcome. It's a family affair, and I'm really excited to be here today to share our conversation. There's a lot we could talk about, but maybe we should start by sharing some common ground. And so really what I'd like to do is begin by thinking about what is disinformation and how is that different from misinformation?
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. So I think perhaps, and this is a tricky point to nail down, we would consider the difference to be intent.
Okay.
So in a lot of ways, misinformation is that which is shared without necessarily the intention to mislead or deceive the receiver of the information, whereas disinformation oftentimes is a systematic effort to deceive or to mislead viewers or listeners or readers.
So I got my facts wrong, misinformation, versus I deceived you, disinformation.
That would be my interpretation. Do you want to add anything?
I think that sounds about right. I think a lot of times disinformation is a little bit more systematic. So you wouldn't necessarily think of your neighbor across the street, Bob, tending to be someone who would probably do widespread disinformation, but you might expect a state to do that or an organization. I mean, it can be done by individual people, but I think typically when we think of disinformation, we think of a systematic attempt to undermine democracy, to cause chaos, such as to create instability, that kind of thing.
And so when you say state, I'm thinking like I imagine you think, and I'm thinking, oh, you're not talking about Oregon or California, you're talking about other countries or other entities beyond what we think of as Ohio or Michigan or Pennsylvania.
Like a country sometimes has an interest in causing trouble in other countries or other parts of the world, or maybe even in their own country.
Sure.
And they might share and kind of have a systematic effort, an intelligence office have, a systematic effort to share incorrect or confusing or misleading information, which is
with
usually
some
disinformation.
Nefarious, I like to use that word, some nefarious purpose, right? Some sort of evil intent.
Well, they might not think it's nefarious, but a lot of times people do consider it to be nefarious. So I guess it depends on who's making the judgment.
So we also live in this world where there's so much information. I talk about it in my classroom in terms of this information age, but it also is an information overload age. And so that can be problematic as well. Kathleen, as you think about this information age, are there things that you see overloading people in our communities?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I would say that in a sense of walking into a room and everybody's screaming, right? So like we're existing within a cacophony of messages. So we are exposed in one day to more messages than our grandparents oftentimes would experience in a year. right? Because we have access to both social media and corporate media on our phones, so that it's in our pocket.
Right.
It's blaring from our speakers. It's on our television. And I actually was just grading an assignment today where I asked my students to reflect on how many hours a day they spend consuming media and whether they do it critically or whether they do it in sort of a non-critical state. And it was not unusual at all for my students to admit to spending 10 to 12 hours a day consuming media. And of course, media here, or at least in their assignment, it referred to sort of like, so media is plural for medium, right? So in their assignment, they're looking at ways that information is being carried to them. So it could be social media, it could be corporate media, it could be nonprofit media. But basically, I think the question isn't so much about how much we're being exposed to, but how much are we being exposed to without without purposefully enacting a critical lens. Right? And what I mean by that is without, how much are we taking in, consuming, looking at, without running it through our reasonable filters of, is this valid? Is it valuable? Is it supported? And I think the issue isn't so much that we're consuming more volume, but that we're consuming it without the tools that allow us to evaluate it for meaningfulness.
Right. And so so many things that I was thinking about, but part of that then means that we are sort of not discerning what messages we're taking in. 10 hours, you said, that just surprises me, and yet maybe if I think, is Spotify on, or am I listening to the radio in the car or on the bus as I'm riding to work, or all of those various forms. And then how many times am I checking my social media, right? Be it my Facebook or my Instagram or my Twitter or whatever. There's good research to suggest that the more time we spend in those realms, the less happy we are, or perhaps even that we are upset, right? Or we're distressed by that level of information that just seems to be forever dragging us down. Anything else you're thinking as you think about this information age?
Yeah, I would just add that it is, I think, very overwhelming to people. I think we're kind of juggling a lot more in our lives than our parents or our grandparents. So, I think we've developed evolutionarily. You can worry about your neighbor whose house might have burned down, or maybe you can worry about what's going on the other side of your village. And our brains have developed in order to process that and to be able to respond to that. But I think it's really challenging for people to even begin to know how to respond to the refugee crisis in Syria, on top of global warming and the flooding in Bangladesh, on top of what is going on at the border in the United States. So it feels, I think you're getting it from so many different directions. It's from such a bigger kind of geographical area. You're getting it in so many different ways. So I think it's really understandable that it feels overwhelming to people. And there's kind of, how can you critically evaluate that? Because you're also trying to get your kids to soccer practice.
Right.
You're also trying to make sure your bills are paid. And I think there's just, I have a lot of empathy for the overwhelm that it causes people. And I think a lot of times we hear people say, like, people need to be more critical. And I'm not saying you're saying that.
It's okay.
But it's, I think we have to balance the demands on everyone. And what would that look like when people are managing so many different things?
Well,
Right.
and if you
Go
don't
ahead.
mind if I add something
Go
to
ahead.
that, I think you're right, and I think something that it's hard for us to notice because it's something that happens at a level that we're not really able to be aware of, is that we literally lack the cognitive capacity in a lot of ways to process things in a certain way. So, for instance, there's all kinds of evidence that scrolling, like the way that we scroll through information, is actually changing our ability to focus and changing our ability to sort of connect our already existent knowledge to new knowledge, right? And so in a sense, and I can see this in my students and they share this with me, in a sense it's just sort of like this constant onslaught that keeps them from ever really engaging with one sort of dense, sort of detailed instance of information. And my students are talking to me about this, about they're unable to focus. They're unable to read dense blocks of text as they felt fairly comfortable doing just say like a few years ago, right?
So all of this information or overload of information in a world that purports to be a democracy that wants people to be engaged in and active in the organization and the sort of leadership and running of this country, right? So that we participate in elections, and yet we're overwhelmed by sometimes the messages that we're getting as it relates to these elections. And so we just finished a recent election, and in the process of doing that, there was quite a bit of sort of difficult conversations, polarized kinds of talk in our communities. And there was disagreement over even core facts about, what is, if you can think of it that way. And I'm trying not to use the word truth because, of course, we seem to not be able to address that as well. But just simply what is. So as we think about that, it really is a messy world, and a world in which we want to participate in our democracy, and yet it's very difficult. This business of polarization, are there things that you see that are contributing to that polarization? And of course, eventually I hope we can talk about what we can do about it.
I guess I would start with, the traditional, the squeaky wheel gets the attention, right? So a lot of times we hear the most intense messages in media, and we only have a little bit of time. We hear like little sound bites, right? So you hear the people who are very upset about this on one side and the people who are very upset about this on another side. And often that makes a good news story to have a yes and a no, a good and a bad, a science and not science. And so what sells in media and what gets attention is, I think, then reshaping how we think about how we're connecting to our communities, how we're connecting to our families. So one of the things that I find is that, often there are people who are really extreme on one side or really extreme on another side, but I think most people are somewhere in the middle. But it's hard to get a sense of that. It's hard to know that that's the case, and also it's hard to get practice listening and understanding and working with people in the middle, because we don't have good models for that. So one of the things that when I was teaching that I found really helpful was we would do these deliberations, right? Where we would talk about an issue from 3 different perspectives. We would kind of look at the pros of that option, the cons of that option. And a lot of times at the end of a deliberation, students would say, I didn't even know that we could talk to each other about this. And they would have like what we called Kentucky kitchen table dinners, because I was teaching in Kentucky, and talk about issues with their family, and they would come back and say, it's much easier to talk about these things than I thought. So I think one thing that I often think about is that it's not as hard as it seems sometimes to talk to people if we're willing to listen, we're willing to share, we're willing to be vulnerable, we're willing to kind of be empathetic and hear where other people are coming from. And I think most people, when you kind of set those ground rules, really appreciate that, and you can get a little further when people are able to do that. So
what I hear you describing, of course, is what I've also used through the National Issue Forum discussion guides that the Kettering Foundation actually is involved in. So, and those have been really helpful for me for discussions that we've had on campus, but also that I've done in the community through the league and through other groups. So I appreciate that. It's this middle that doesn't make for good news, right? And so you don't get a sense of how many people are in the middle when what we're hearing are the blaring sirens from either side.
Well, I think something also to be said is that, it is so pleasing and gratifying to be presented with 2 options that are clear-cut, and one is right and one is wrong. I mean, I am a black and white thinker. Something I'm really working on, but I absolutely see the appeal of simplicity, right? So if one person's telling you, no, it's really easy, it's really simple, these people are the bad people and these people are the good people. I mean, even I fall for that. When we were talking to prepare this, I kept saying the bad people, and Liz kept saying, no, you can't, and you're like, you're right. And so the thing is I think that one thing that's really important is to be suspicious of anybody who tells you that things are simple, because they're not. Like, even in an ideological way, things are complex, but then you apply it to humans who are messy and silly and wonderful and passionate and mean and nice and loving. Everything gets complicated. And so if you are not allowing for the complexity of lived reality, then of course you're going to sound the most appealing because you have all the answers.
Right.
And they're easy answers.
And that's convenient,
yeah.
right?
Well, and
although it
feels
doesn't
good.
necessarily work once it's applied.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the observation I make as a person who looks at political, I guess, campaigns. And the speaker who has that sort of simple message might be seen initially as the better speaker, but then later on people realize, oh, but wait, when we check the facts, we find out that that isn't entirely true, or that we find out that it's more complex, as you're suggesting, than they suggested, and those kinds of things. So it's messy, it's difficult, and I think social media has probably only contributed further to the messiness of that. Any thoughts about what do we do with this sort of social media mess? I mean, every time I open my phone, there's these voices that are shouting at me.
I keep it only because I foster cats and adopt them out through social media.
Okay, so you use it.
I say that, but then of course I also use it for other resources. So I think in a sense it would be trying to figure out how to disentangle it from its instrumental purposes versus those, like what you mentioned, the idea that it makes us less happy. You know, when we're constantly being presented with images that have been, and this is an interesting point to misinformation. Misinformation doesn't just have to be words. How about the fact that we're constantly inundated with body images that are incredibly unrealistic, leaving people really unhappy with the way that they look and comparing themselves to unrealistic standards. And so in a sense, it's sort of maybe, I guess, the answer is mindfulness, right? Being aware of what you're consuming, even if it's not critically aware, but looking at it and knowing you're looking at it, rather than just doing this and then realizing 10 hours have passed.
So what I think we should do when we see these images, magazine images of models, right, that are fashion models, whatever, with their clothing or whatever they're trying to sell us, there should be like a little disclaimer, just a little asterisk that says, I work out 6 hours a day and I eat almost nothing to look like this, right? I mean, there should be some sense of fairness because I'm not willing to work out 6 hours a day.
That implies it's natural, though. That's not even the case, right? They're like
oh, for
even
sure,
the
yeah.
body that ended up with 6 hours a day working out and eating celery
still had to be retouched.
Got retouched to look slimmer.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's just leaving people in a situation where they feel like nothing they do helps them win. And that's really, really frustrating and saddening,
So what do we do to support people that do want to use social media but don't want to be sort of come victim to that mentality? Are there things that we can do to diminish the amount of misinformation perhaps that we share, or in other ways try to help clarify?
I mean, I think that keeping in mind that the map is not the territory, right? What we see on our Facebook feeds or our Twitter feeds is not it's not the world that we live in. And I think just, gently pulling ourselves back to that, reminding ourselves of that, and also trying hard to balance between who we are in real life and who we are on social media. So maybe not speaking to people on social media or writing things in a way that we wouldn't say in person.
Right. Or we wouldn't want to say in front of our grandmother, right? That idea that, or we wouldn't want to see printed in the paper tomorrow morning.
Yeah. I was going to say you've never met our grandmother.
Oh.
No, I'm kidding. But in a lot of ways, I mean, I feel like the conversation is oversimplified if we make it sound like, oh, just only say nice things, right?
Right.
I think in a lot of ways, like your point, everybody that I've been talking to lately about anything having to do with the political realm have expressed sort of like fear or apprehension about some of the more radical or some of the more like marginal ideas, and it really is every single time it takes effort to remind people that that's not representative of a majority of people, right? And that's something that I even have to I'll get worked up and think, oh, these people are crazy. And then I'll realize, wait a second, no, I'm hearing from the people who are most bombastic to get the attention.
Right.
And we need to remind ourselves that what we're seeing on not just social media, but also in the corporate media is not representative of the your neighbor Bob, who is not running like a misinformation factory out of his basement, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I knew this was going to be a lively conversation. We were going to have lots to talk about. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to try to move toward maybe what can we do to counter the misinformation. Earlier we talked about some of this, and we talked about on-ramps, right? On-ramps for people to be able to hear and understand one another. What are those on-ramps? Where do we find those?
You know, I think what we talked about earlier, recognizing that people are complex and people are many, right? So your uncle is not just a Democrat or not just a Republican, or your neighbor is not just someone who goes to this church or someone who believes this, but that people are complicated. And so I think talking with people who are different than us, listening to them, being willing to hear and willing to share, but also one of the things that I've found in my work in communities over the years and with deliberation is that a lot of times, even if we don't agree on everything, we can come together around a shared challenge that we're facing. We can figure out what we want to do about that. We can deliberate about that. We can kind of find some common ground for action and do that. And that really gives us something to build on.
Right.
That we can achieve some things, even if we don't agree on everything, to create the kind of communities that we want. I think it feeds us a lot, and it nourishes communities, it nourishes us. And once you've solved this problem or you've addressed this problem together, you know your neighbor Juan or you know your neighbor Cindy, and all of a sudden you know each other, and you can work on one thing together, you can work on another thing together. So
Right.
I think that's one on-ramp.
You talk about the complexities of individuals, and I'm thinking like a sociologist, that's called intersectionality.
Yeah, I mean, sort of. They're not
Okay.
interchangeable, but yeah. So intersectionality is the recognition that we all exist at a site of interlocking identities, right? So, for instance,
So I'm not just a man,
right.
but
Well, if I were to presume your racial
Go for it.
identity
Okay.
from looking at you, actually, how about I not do that?
You
I'm
can,
really
though. I mean-
uncomfortable with it.
Well.
So how about I ask you, how do you identify racially?
I call myself a European American.
Okay, super.
Because white just seems to be the wrong expression.
Well, I mean, I'm with you. I always like the Caucasian. I was going to be like, your family's from the Caucasus Mountains?
Yeah.
But yeah, so like you are a number of different identities, and those identities don't exist in exclusion from one another. And they all have power dynamics that are embedded within them, and they also all have social significance that is not necessarily a reflection of your own volition or of your own interpretation or even your own identity, right? So you can't ignore the power, you can't ignore the way that they exist hierarchically a lot of times, and you can't ignore the fact that they have socio-historical significance.
I love it.
Oh, thanks. I love talking sociology.
Yeah, I know you do. And I like being involved in those conversations too. So
Can I add to
Yeah.
the conversation about how to make, I just want to say, read more books. Like,
Ah.
there are so few questions that cannot be answered by exploring. And even if you don't want to read nonfiction, so nonfiction true. So even if you don't want to read nonfiction, read books about people who are unlike you.
Yeah.
Learn about cultures that are unlike your own, and the more you realize that, the last animal to discover water was the fish, right? So if you can escape from your own familiarity, if you can escape from taking for granted that your own experiences are what everybody else experiences, it's much easier then to move to an understanding that this is how I feel and this is what I think, but other people feel and think differently, and it's equally valid, right? In sociology, we call it cultural relativism.
Right. So I also think about something that I've heard about called the longest table, where people will gather in a community, maybe across the Peace Bridge, with a long table, right? And then just share a meal and share a series of questions. And I know we've done this, I forget which organization in town did that a number of years ago. Perhaps after COVID, we can get back to doing those kinds of things and really get to know one another in that more personal way. It's been a sort of a fun but also challenging conversation, because what we're talking about really is communicating across our differences in this age of misinformation. And so I just want to thank our guest, Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Gish. thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And soon to be, to me, Dr. Kathleen Gish, because I know you're working on that degree and I know you're going to finish it.
Yes, within the year I shall be Dr. Gish.
That's amazing, and so I'm
Thank
just
you.
so thankful that you both were able to come and join with me today. So as we wrap things up then, I just want to suggest that thank you as listeners for participating with us tonight as we discuss how we manage through the misinformation as we belong to this democracy that relies on the accuracy and the sort of consistency of information in our world. So then I have enjoyed our conversation. I want to just thank everyone for participating. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to participate in all of the elections, not just once, but every election. And if you have further questions about this or upcoming programs, you can contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org. You can mail that to league@lwvdayton.org. Or call our office at number 937-228-4041. Thank you for sharing your time with us, and be well.